stage. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I've got to stand like this. I feel like Ian Paisley them behind that. Now listen, yeah, we have been talking about psychopaths all weekend. We really have, even if they haven't always used those terms. But every presentation talks about that. Someone recently said to me, if you were to bring a psychopath down into its basic term, what would be the most basic term of what they are, description, and how they affect us? And I said, well, I thought about it, and I said, a psychopath creates an empire of bullshit, and then they tell us it's not bullshit. Isn't that true? Isn't that the world we live in? And that was what I gave him. Now, it came out of the top of my head, which is something I'm not always particularly good at. But it was good, because it was like, it made me think, okay, we can get this down to a sort of the same way they deal with us. Now, an empire of bullshit would be religion. Religion is a way of masking spirituality in an empire of bullshit. You know, I grew up in a rough neighborhood next to a sandpaper factory, and no, I really did, right? I'm traumatized by my background. But anyway, I grew up in a tough neighborhood in the north side of Dublin, a high-rise 1960s brutalistic architecture thingy. And a friend of mine was a drug dealer, and he had this idea that if he pretended to be a Jehovah's Witness, he wouldn't arouse suspicion. It worked for 15 minutes. The police got suspicious when the doors were being opened. Now, another example of an empire of bullshit would be the 40 years that the BBC protected Jimmy Savile. That was it. That's why I make a big deal of that whole thing, and I'll probably never let it go, because that's their Achilles heel that we can always torture them with. Let's get them back with what they use on us. That's my attitude. Empire of bullshit, you know. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about Jimmy Savile, and in so many ways, and he wasn't human, just like Bill Oddie said. That was not a human being. And you know, I was reading so much about him, I'm still not convinced some days he's dead, like he's come back as a sex demon, like a succubus or an incubus. And one morning I'll wake up with a Jim will fix it badge around my neck. So I went to bed last night, right, with this fucking thing on me. Serious. And then, no, serious, and I woke up this morning, right, and I had a lovely night of sleep, and I went like this, and I'm feeling down, and then it's just, you know, for that split second where reality and fantasy kind of meet, well, not fantasy, but you know what I mean, terror. And then I realized, oh, it's this thing, okay? And then I said, you know what this is? This is our we will fix it badge. That's what that is. So, okay, I called this the shock doctrine. Why? Because I couldn't think of another name. But it does work, because we're kept in a state of perpetual shock, okay? And that's what happens to us. We're thrown into this empire of bullshit, and we can't deal with it, okay? So we're in a perpetual state of shock, followed by a perpetual state of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's residual, that's perennial, that never stops. And because it never stops, we never have the ability to pause, take a breath, and say, we're living in an empire of bullshit. Because if that was to happen, the whole world would tumble. And that's why we live in a sensory overload society. If you've ever been in a relationship with a psychopath, it moves like this, very, very fast. If you have a psychopath bully boss at work, he's moving around, changing furniture. It's shock, it's constant. You're never allowed to think. This is why we have so many TV channels. This is why we have so many distractions. This is why everything is loud. This is why music has denigrated into this awful. Pop music is terrible today, isn't it? Awful. And it's not even, there's no songs, no melodies. And I'm not like I'm not looking for Bing Crosby to rise from the grave, thank God. But it's like, you know what I'm saying? It's just awful beats, high tempo. You know, someone asked me, do you like dubstep? I said, my dial-up modem used to do that back in the 1990s. But it's like, that's what it's like. We're constantly rattled. Our whole senses are done. And we're in a perpetual state of overload. And so I spent the last 3 years looking at the psychopath issue and just telling as many people as I could about it. I said, listen, it's pretty straightforward. There's a percentage of this planet, probably 1%, 4% if you're in the BBC, maybe more. But when you know what they are, that they don't care, that it's just business, and no matter how they damage you, in a relationship, as a bully at work, anyway like that, the biggest problem that causes the post-traumatic stress disorder is you trying to say, why didn't this person have any decency? Why didn't this person act so strange? Why did this person have no feelings at the end? And then when you realise that it wasn't a human being like you, it's a tremendously healing experience. And that's what's happening here. That's what's happening with the so-called wake-up community. We are figuring out that the system has been engineered by psychopaths for their benefit. They've created an empire of bullshit, and we cannot handle it until we figure it out. And when we figure it out, then we're free. We're not free of the system, but we have that pause, that parentheses between words, that silent space that allows us to formulate an escape plan. And that's so important. And that's why this movement is happening. And that's why these events are happening. Because when you realise that there's no hope for them, you don't get on the black or white chessboard squares anymore. You get off the chessboard completely. And you're no longer a pawn. And that was the purpose of my work for the last 3 years. I used to be a graphic designer and a communications consultant on Wall Street. So Neil was doing my job there a bit. And that's what it was like. It was crap. It was just like that. You lie to people. Now, I didn't do that. My job was to write the scripts and create the graphics. And we're getting as good as they are. Brian had an inspired graphic yesterday that showed the pyramidal scheme. And when he showed where the red bar went up, as it got towards the top, that's where corruption was. That red bar could have easily been the psychopaths. The same percentage. As you move towards the top, they cluster at the top. And they cluster at the top because the system is engineered for that to happen. And the reason why it happens, I saw it in my own. I hate when people say, oh, everybody on Wall Street is a psychopath or a complete bastard. They're not. There's loads of decent people who work there. They don't get promoted. There's loads of brilliant people who work there, brilliant mathematicians, people who, if they were allowed to get near the financial system, would fix it. They're not allowed near it because they don't want them on top. They only want their own kind. Now, when you realise that, you understand then there's a malignancy, a pathological malignancy to the system, and there's no way of fixing it, so you have to get out of it. Now, my attitude is, when you deal with a psychopath, it's no contact ever again. And then people say, well, that's okay, it's just you can get another job. If you can't do that? Well, then you slowly make contingency to escape, piecemeal. What you're really doing is you're creating a new reality for yourself in your own life, a new form of consciousness even, for you to slip in there that a psychopath can't follow you. And this is what we have to do in this movement going forward. We have to literally stop. I mean, I know it's not happening anymore. It was happening when I first came into the scene. People were saying, we've got to change the system and all this kind of thing. We've got to engage with the system. I don't believe the system in any way can ever be fixed. It's like putting a hairdryer to a corpse. It's not going to do anything. And that's literally... So the best thing is just to move out. And I call that a consciousness insurgent. A kind of a dissident of the mind. They can pass all the laws they want. They can do everything they want. You don't have to go along with it. You do not have to go along with it. Now, let me explain to you what magic is. Magic is not Harry Potter, it's not I Dream of Jeannie, it's not Bewitched. That's not what magic is. It's not even the sort of stereotypical aspects of what we think magic is. Magic is changing your opinions through somebody else by making you believe something that's not real and you eventually accepting it. To change you if I was a magician, I'd be changing you in conformity with my will. So that's what a public relations person, that's what Eric Bernays is in what they call an instinctual black magician. Maybe he did, I don't know. But he was applying that knowledge of taking propaganda, turning it into, using the psychoanalytical tools of his uncle Sigmund Freud, turning it into public relations and making people defective so they could sell them the cure. So you create a sense of sort of insecurity, you fill it with a boob job, you fill it with a sports car. Things that are not natural to us, they fill it. So that's what magic is. Oh, that's all magic is. Just changing just changing reality, making you think differently. It's nothing else. And that's what advertising and everything else is. Now, yesterday Brian said, he called it Satanism. He's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. But it's not Satanism like worship of the devil. If you look at what Satanism is, say under the Church of Satan, under Anton LaVey, founded in April 30th, 1966, very significant date, April 30th, which we'll get to later on. It was founded by him. You look at what their basic tenet is. It's almost like a spiritual form of Darwinism. Might is right. The end justifies the means. This is what it is. And it doesn't matter. To achieve that, I will take it, I will do it any way I want. And that's how it is today. They pass laws, they change statutes, they poison us with fluoride, they do whatever they want, they destroy our lives, they fill us with all this empire of bullshit, and it's ultimately black magic because it's not what we want, but they're telling us it's what we want. And a large segment of the population, including me until a few years ago, believed that that was what I want because I was under the spell of a magician. And a lot of us have broken that spell. We have. We now know we're not under that control. But when we engage in their system, we'll often meet people who are. And it's almost like, you meet someone who's like completely different than your opinions. You're almost shocked by how you've evolved away from them. Not in a judgmental way, but it's almost like to the point where you've evolved away from them, but they're almost hostile that you have. Now, the expression, the ultimate expression of that, and saying what we deal with, and me, I haven't had it too badly compared to other people, would be these skeptics and these debunkers, these hardcore materialists. I've nothing against it. I was a hardcore atheist for most of my life until I had, mainly because of the country I grew up in and the whole Catholic Protestant made me sick. I hate all religion. But, then things happen and you have amazing experiences. Then you say, well, I can't deny this anymore, okay? That's what happened to me. But, I'm not preachy about it or anything like that, just the way I am. Accept it. Now, these types, we encountered them. And someone said to me, well, how do you defeat black magic? How do you defeat it? And I was saying, well, I don't know. And I thought about it for a while. And then I remembered something that happened to me last year. And one of those skeptic fellas is like from the North Dublin skeptics, 6-inch nail up the backside league. And this guy ambushed me at an event. And he goes, yeah, come here, those little bastards, and his friend filming him. The idea was to catch me out on camera so they could upload it on YouTube. So, you said that the political system is psychopathic. Well, how can you explain that when we have, democracy? This kind of thing. And I was listening there, and everything he said, and I was like, now, I had a few pints on me. Again, I sometimes make wrong decisions. This time I made a good one. So, he said, and his friends, filming. And I knew what was going on. I could have ripped every single point he made to pieces, right? And I thought about it for a second. And I went to the camera, talk to the hand, bitch. I don't know why I did it. His friend laughed so loud he dropped the camera. And that's how you defeat black magic. The menu. Okay, Now we get serious, kind of. Something happened in Munich, in Bavaria, in Germany, in 1919, and the world that we Europeans live in today is a result of what happened then. On April 30th, 1919, on Walpurgis night, Walpurgis Day, the day before May Day, the witches' Sabbath, two members of a group called the Thule Society were taken by this group called the Spartakists, who were Bolshevik revolutionaries who had created a Bolshevik Soviet in Bavaria. It was a horror show for the short time it had existed. The leader was a guy called Levine, and he said that the bourgeois babies should all starve, let's deny them milk. This is the kind of classic psychopathic socialist Marxist revolution that comes in. Well, they tell you, well, those people have upper class accents, they're telling you you're living in a worker's paradise. You know, they've never been in the factory in their lives or down a mine. A typical Bolshevik thing. And they had some prisoners that they picked up at the Four Seasons at the hotel. Among them, including a bunch of artists and a Jewish college professor who was disgusted by the Bolsheviks. They were taken to the schoolyard and they were shot with dum-dum bullets and all killed, deliberately to antagonize the other side, the anti-communists. They did this deliberately on Walpurgis Day because they knew that there was an emergence of traditional folk culture that had been happening in Germany since the mid-18th century, and taken accelerated, particularly after the Enlightenment. Because what happened after the Enlightenment was that Germany, particularly for Lutherans and Protestants, they'd lost the magic out of their religion. The whole thing of reason came in. It wasn't so bad for Catholics because there was still, among Catholics, you had the transubstantiation, so there was a sense of magic and ritual with the Catholic Mass. But the Protestants had lost that, and as this in Germany, and as this had accelerated, people began to notice a void within the Germanic personality, the Teutonic personality, regarding a spiritual dimension. So they started to create these folkish groups, these German folk spiritual land groups. And very early on they were corrupted. And they were corrupted by very dark people. And some very strange cults came along, like the Order of the Templars. And individuals by the name of Landsman's Lebensfeld, who actually was the first person to hoist the swastika above his cult compound near Vienna, I think it was, and a guy called Guido von List. And they began to associate spirituality with the life force of human blood, which could be possible. But what you were seeing was the precursor of the idea that genetics was everything. And this, they created deliberate neuroses about German blood, that Germans had lost their magical powers as a race, and they were defeated in World War. They were defeated and humiliated because their blood was impure. This was a strange kind of scientific aspect towards the occult, towards these kind of bizarre sort of aristocrat Prussian, black hexan paganism kind of ideas. It fostered in Germany as a kind of Freemasonry. It never really got bad, but it was noticed. It was noticed around the world, particularly over here, by the Fabian Society. If you haven't heard from about the Fabian Society, you better. They're unbelievably powerful and influential, but they're based in London. Lots of things and scenarios came about where they created the future, but they started using, in some ways, and they weren't using Germany as a test case, they were monitoring what was going on in Germany. Because they were very eager to destroy all spirituality and just have a purely scientific society around the world under one world government, very early on, late 1800s. So they were looking at what's happening in Germany, what's going right with the loss of spirituality, what's going wrong with it, that kind of thing. So Germany was inadvertently a psychic spiritual basket case. And these folkish movements, along with atheism, started to rise in a very powerful way as we went towards World War I. One of the individuals that came along was a guy called Chamberlain, and he was an Englishman who was married to I think the granddaughter of the composer Richard Wagner. And he had encouraged Kaiser Wilhelm to enter the war against England and against Russia after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, saying that this was the magical quest of the German people. And that's how World War I came about. Now, by the time this had happened, just about every royal family in Europe was German. Either through the Hanoverians, the House of Baden, Holsteins, and that's why the British royal family had a German name. But it wasn't just here, it was everywhere. Everywhere was a royal family. And essentially, they began a cult. They began a cult following the creation of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, where the transfer of capital and wealth ownership was taken from Europe to the United States, and they knew there would be massive unemployment in Europe. And this was all part of the experiment. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but we're dealing with psychopaths. And they don't see you and me and anyone else as anything other than a lab rat. You have to remember that. We are to them what the chickens are to Colonel Sanders. That's how important we are. I know it's funny, but that's a good allegory. Now, anyway, the Second World War happened. It was a horrific thing. And then it ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. Just a coincidence. And then it was declared to be the war to end all wars. Now, we're taught about that in school, and we're taught about the beginning of the Second World War, but how many people remember remember learning about 1919? 1919 was a year of horrific turmoil in Europe. There were uprisings, rebellions, and wars everywhere. They weren't officially under the blanket of the Great War, but they were everywhere. From Romania annexing Moldova to Estonia going to war against the Soviet Union quite rightly, considering what the Bolsheviks were up to there, to my own country, Ireland, declaring a republic and having to go to war for the next 3 years against the Great Britain to win our independence. It was going on everywhere. If that wasn't going on, there was all kinds of other minor revolutions. Now, one of these revolutions was the Spartacus Revolution. It happened in Berlin. It was an individual called Rosa Luxemburg. After the Weimar Republic was declared, which was basically Germany, the old imperial Germany had been rebuilt as a new nation put under crushing debts to pay off their loans to European and American banks who told the Germans it was a humanitarian loan, but in reality it was just like the IMF. The idea was they were incensing Germans. They were deliberately firing Germans up, making them as angry and as humiliating them as possible. So 1919 comes along, Rosa Luxemburg and the Spartacus League, they begin a revolution in Berlin. She's taken out outside and murdered, and that revolution is crushed for a while. Another one builds up again, and these people, as I said, declared a Soviet Marxist Bolshevik Republic called the Bavarian Soviet, with Munich as the headquarters. As this was happening, and as these people were being shot in the schoolyard that I told you about, two of them were members of the aristocrat. One of them was a prince and the other one was a countess, both involved in this occult group called the Thule Society. The Thule Society, if you haven't heard about them, and you probably haven't, because every even academic aspect of the Third Reich and the growth of Germany at that time plays these guys down. Oh, and there was an occult group called the Thule Society. And when you look at this, it literally was the future to come. On the same day that they were shot, Prussian Free Corps, which were former veterans of World War I in the trenches, highly trained German troops, were descending on Munich to liberate the Bavarian Soviet, to crush the Bavarian Soviet, depending on what side you're on, I'm neither. And among them was an individual and a Thulist running a group called the Thule Combat League. They were driving in tanks that had the skull and crossbones, the swastika, and the SS rune sign on them. 1919 now. Adolf Hitler was still in a hospital in Germany recovering. And at the head of this was a guy called Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess is one of the most incredible characters in history, and that's a story that has never been fully revealed what went on there. But that's someone. This is our real history. We're given one thing, and you see other aspects. But anyway, they crushed the Bavarian Soviet. The creeps that started it did a runner back to Russia, and there was a bloodbath in the streets of Munich. The Tool Society and the Tool Combat League, after they crushed the Bavarian Soviet, then began creating a kind of a pseudo-political system. But they hadn't got a name for a party. But the whole thing was they needed what they called the Freie Christus, which means the Germanic Aryan Christ. They had been brought up to believe that Germany would be saved by a saviour. Not far away, in a hospital, was a guy called Adolf Hitler. He was a lieutenant in the German army, won the Iron Cross, and by all accounts, was just like a regular German to that point. There was no history of him being anything the monster he became. He walked into Germany, into Bavaria, and he encountered people like Ernst Röhm, who's the later leader of the Brown Shirts, and he also encountered Rudolf Hess inside the Four Seasons hotels, where something happened. What we were seeing was the common purpose of its day. When Brian talks about people being reframed and retrained, suddenly this guy, who had an interest in politics, was making incredible speeches at the German army base that was enthralling everyone, and it came out of nowhere. He suddenly had a vast canon of information of European history. Now, he did have an interest in the occult, which is very important prior to that, but he wasn't a dynamic personality. He was captivating the army veterans in the barracks. And on September 11th, 1919, he was informed of a meeting taking place in a pub on the Tal in Munich by a small group called the German Workers' Party, and he was to infiltrate it as a spy. He went in there, and a speech was made about declaring Bavaria as a republic, that Germany was dead. He rose to his feet, and he gave this impassioned speech that literally was the Adolf Hitler that we came to know. For the next decade or so, until 1940, he was shadowed by this individual called Rudolf Hess, an aristocrat who had, my opinion, had programmed him, had reframed him. And this guy was in communication with aristocrats in Britain, in particular members of, I can't prove it directly, but I can prove it anecdotally, H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, the usual suspects. These guys in the Fabian Society were deliberately drumming up a Second World War. They were obsessed with, they didn't get what they wanted from the First World War. It failed very badly for them. They were hoping to get a completely Bolshevik Europe. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Nationalism came about, so you had Ireland becoming free, and you had the development of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, nations that didn't previously exist, to solve these problems out of the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The synchronicities are phenomenal. And you had the streets of Vienna on the same time. You had Sigmund Freud, Edward Bernays, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, just by coincidence. And the next thing you have is a fermentation that leads towards what becomes National Socialism. All the while, and this is completely documented, and it's all there to be found if you can read a book that's not written by somebody who's making a BBC documentary about the National Socialists. The whole thing was heavily supported from outside because they wanted a united Europe. This is what they want. They didn't care if it was under Bolsheviks, they could change that. They didn't care if it was under capitalism, but they preferred socialism, because then they could control production levels. That way they could keep the aristocrats in power who owned all the factories and all the production. They would always stay rich. But ultimately, their idea was developed and sort of fermented into Germany on top of this sort of racial idea of blood. At the same time, they were fermenting these ideas into the Soviet countries, into people like Trotsky and Marx, with the idea of the workers' paradise. Remember, the Nazis are called the National Socialists. If you were ever dealing with some lefty who goes, I'm not a Nazi, and then remind them that it was socialist was at the end of that. They were socialists. That's another spell that's been played upon us. So they didn't care if it was Russian Soviet, Bolshevik Soviet, socialism, or National Socialism. They were getting what they wanted from both sides. They were very happy. So they fermented these ideas out. Now, to see the depth that this goes to and continues to this day, last week I found a speech. Now, I've been researching about for 3 years now, non-stop, very high academic history books of, that's what I do, I take the hard shit and I make it easy for ordinary people to understand because they're hiding stuff from us. It's as simple as that. And I took this stuff and I was looking at it, and it's frightening to see how the Nazis were basically put into power by the Western powers, particularly the bankers. They saw no wrong with this, nothing. And they were quite willing to deal with all the other stuff that went along with it, because they were seeing something here they wanted. Now, the European president, the EU president, which none of us voted for, Van Rompuy, said last week in a speech, nasty little man, he looks like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, and he's your leader, said, the aim is to have a European Union that stretches from the west coast of Ireland to the Urals, and be from the Arctic Circle down to North Africa. There'll be resistance from some places, particularly the Balkans. It matters not. In a generation, the next generation will have it. Arrogant, horrible little man. And I was thinking to myself, where did I hear this before? It's in Mein Kampf. Yeah. Adolf Hitler said, who are you? The Reich will stretch from the Atlantic to the Urals. Who are you? You'll be dead, and I will own your children. And isn't that what Brian was talking about the other day? And this was all fermented in the 1930s. And we're still living in that world today. They just changed the terms of reference. Black magic. As Patrick said, it's not a cover-up, it's a cock-up. National Socialism, the Third Reich, when they were voting when we were told to vote for the Lisbon Treaty and get the right result, guys. There was people spray painting all over the town near where I live. No Fourth Reich. And I was thinking to myself, that's a bit hysterical. It makes the no side look bad. Well, if I was to know what I know then, I'd be down there with those kids in the can of spray paint. Because that's what it is. Standardization was all developed through Germany. The relationship between production, corporate production, medicines, everything like that, and government plans was done in the Third Reich. For instance, you know the way today we see it seems like humans have less rights than some animals or something like that. The psychopaths in charge care more about horses than they do about people, right? During National Socialism, there were complex laws that were sent to every single restaurant in Germany, telling them that you had to how to humanely kill a lobster. At the same time, people were being marched into ovens and gas chambers, shot. This is what they're like. This is exactly how they think. The same thing happens today. Bureaucracy in terms of minutiae of data and regulations. A friend of mine in Ireland pointed out that there's something like 40,000 words for the EU regulation for the sale of cabbages. This is started in Germany. Word salad, spellbinding, black magic. That's what it's like. And they did ISO 900. All these standardization systems written for the benefit of the big corporations began under these times. And we're never told this. We're told, oh, the Nazis were evil. The Nazis were, and they were evil. But we're not, even though we're doing the same thing. And that's exactly how a psychopath is. There was a great survey done in Canada in 2011 where they interviewed psychopathic killers in prison and rapists, and they would say, and they discovered that psychopaths have a completely different version of reality going forward than the one they left behind, because they switch personas, and they would say things to them like, so, Mr. So-and-so, you're in here for rape. Oh, I'm not a rapist. You've been convicted of raping 15 women. Oh no, I'm not a rapist. I was a rapist then, but I'm not now. Because a new personality had been constructed and the previous one didn't exist. They have no internal personality. So that's why they can repeat the same things that the Third Reich did and not see the irony of it. But this is a powerful weapon we can use against them because they don't see irony. They're not good at that. And we can undermine them through satire and humour. I've been doing that for years. Back in the day, during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, I was ripping the piss out of both sides on the internet. I used to create like Sinn Féin sex chat rooms and stuff like that, where they could call up and get the price of Semtex and stuff. Or the other ones where I used to do voices of like Ian Paisley, and you could like be turned on by him, and it was brilliant. It was brilliant. And I even, well, until I got a phone call from what they call the lads, saying, you know, they fancy my kneecap, so I had to stop that. But I found the power of that, and later on, some guy who was in the Provost saw that, and he said, you know something, we were all laughing at it. The power of that, that's the way we can get them down. And so it's a great way for us to survive. They don't see irony. For instance, okay, let's, to show nothing has changed, what's the big issue at the moment? The Ukraine. You have Angela Merkel on one side, is she Portuguese or something? And you have the Russians, Putin on the other, fighting over what was basically living space, Lebensraum. Nothing has changed. The Nazis wanted the Ukraine for two reasons. One, they wanted to exploit the grain and harvestings there, which is what I.G. Farber wanted, and who wants it now? Monsanto, the same company. Philosophically, the same idea. They wanted the oil fields in the Caucasus at any cost. That's what the Battle of Stalingrad was about. That's why both sides were willing to pour incredible numbers of troops, not just Germans and Soviets, Russians, but also Italians, Romanians, Hungarians, and were killed in vast numbers there. At any cost, they wanted those oil fields protected. Either the Nazis wanted them, or the Russians could keep them. Again, what has every single war been about since then? Oil. Oil and resources. Nothing has changed. The war happens, it ends. Someone tells us, well, the Nazis lost World War II. No, the Nazis didn't lose World War II. The Germans lost World War II. The Nazis just rebranded themselves as new names. And that because they've done all this experimentation within the fermentationist mess they had created, this horror show they created in Central Europe, they had gotten so much more skills to do what they want. Because ultimately these people they see us as animals. And it all comes out of these aristocratic ideas of behaviorism, like the idea of Pavlov, the Pavlov's dog. You ring the bell at dinner time, eventually the dog salivates. You have Watson and his behaviorism, saying, I covered that in Animal of the Psyche, this belief that a human being is not a soul, this belief that the human being is not an individual, this belief that the human being is predestined to fulfill their genetic destiny. And there's nothing else. Where did that come from? Blood. The Nazis and blood. What your blood was what you would determine. And that's why they had this whole thing of going back and seeing if you were an Aryan, full German as far as 17, whatever it was, 40-something. They were obsessed with it in the same way the Genome Project is obsessed with finding the personality of who your grandchildren are going to be through your genes. The same thing. It all ferments out of there. They just changed the language. Now, we all know that within a very short time, it was proven that the Nazis and their whole idea of blood was rubbish. It just didn't stand. It just didn't stand. But it was to create a superiority complex. It just did not stand. The same thing is happening today with things like the Genome Project. Now you have this enormous genome project that's been developed, and monstrous, massive finances, and the main thing they're looking for there is the idea of hereditary personalities. They want to be able to predict your personality before you're born, based on what your parents' personality, grandparents' personalities are. This comes out of the whole idea of moral imbecility and the idea that poor people were intrinsically something wrong with them. Again, Darwinism gone nuts. comes out a whole idea of Watson and the rest of them, that your genes determine everything you are. This is exactly the same thing the Nazis did with blood. They just changed it to genome. And the genome project has been a failure. It has not shown the hereditable factor in determining personality. And that's why vast amounts of companies who are investing in it slowly pulled away. The New Scientist had a phenomenal article a few years ago by Professor Steve Jones, not the one with the Sex Pistols, about a few years back, about the failings of the genome project. And he said, pull it, because we've already discovered that there are no personalities in genes. Your personality does not come from your genes, it comes from somewhere else. This is what the Nazis believed, and this is what the EU are now telling you in everything. You go to anything in the doctor now, anywhere in the EU, they all want to know your genetic history. They want to know everything. As if that's the determining. They want to have this ability to predict the future, because I'll tell you why they're obsessed with predicting the future. They're obsessed with predicting the future because it's the only reason they're still in power. And by creating the future, they can create something for us to slot into and then think that's the way it's supposed to be. It's just how change happens. Now, one of the main tools they've done this, and you're going to laugh when you hear this, but I'm telling you this is 100% true, is popular science fiction. Do you think the purpose of science fiction is to entertain? No, that's your program going forward, and has been for a long time. The very first science fiction novel created that I'm aware of was a book called Vril, The Coming of the Master Race. It was written in the 1870s by a person connected to these elite groups, and the idea was that inside the earth was a master race that had this magical power contained in their blood. They were called the Vrilya. And with this magical power, they could do anything and rule the world any way they wanted. The book was a massive sensation, so much so that people thought it was real. They were really going around the world looking for holes in the earth where these angelic Aryan beings called the Vrilya lived. This impressed H.G. Wells' The Fabian Society so much that he wanted a piece of that action. If people will believe a fairy tale, let's start writing their fairy tales. He wrote a book called Things to Come. And people are reading that book today and they're going, can you believe he predicted that? No, he was giving us the script. And we were fulfilling it. He wrote The Time Machine. Guy goes into the future in a time machine, and in the future he discovers there's two races, the Eli and the Morlocks. The Eli are beautiful, Aryan, angelic beings, and they're shown as the correct ones, and what makes them so beautiful is they're childlike. They've lost the ability to be inquisitive. They haven't read books in so long that their books have turned to dust. And they sit around and are given a vegetarian diet, and they sit in the sunshine all day, and they wake up when a bell rings, they go to sleep when a bell rings. And then when they reach a certain age, a horn blows, the gates just open, and they're led to a tunnel, and they're eaten by a group under the ground called the Morlocks. And these were the dark races who had to go live inside the earth. This was fascism put across in a novel. H.G. Wells also wrote a book called Little Wars, not long before the First World War, based on the Prussian idea, or back in Germany again, of training little boys using toys, using particularly Britain's die-cast metal soldiers and guns. Now, I'm not putting down people who are professional soldiers or anything like that. I'm not one of those people. I'm not one of these people that think people in the army. I'm not against that at all. I understand why people become professional soldiers. But they were doing it and teaching English boys and Irish boys, because remember Ireland was part of the Union then, how to play with these models, how to shoot artillery, how to calculate ranges, how to assault targets based on turns and so on. So when the war came out, they were already trained, because they'd learned this from the Prussians, who in the 1870s hammered the shite out of the French during the Franco-Prussian War, because they had been trained in school how to fight. So when the Franco-Prussian War broke out, the French were destroyed in no times. The Prussians were on the inside Paris within like a few days, and everyone who went around the world went, how the hell did they do that? And they said, well, we trained them to be soldiers in school. And that's where education comes from. And that's why in education in school you had marching. How did they make you march in school? Times tables. 111 is 11, 2 11s is 22. That's marching. It puts you in a robotic mindset. it switches off the neural pathways in your right brain, so you become an automaton of the system. And then from that point on, the further you go higher up the education system, the more you become an instinctual defender of orthodoxy, until you reach PhD level and you pile it higher and deeper. You want to meet the most closed-minded people in the world, look for PhDs generally, not all, of course. By the time they get there, they're so entrenched in orthodoxy, they've had so much of the neural pathways in their right brain switched off, that they're literally robots. And this was designed for that reason. Now it's changing. We're coming into we're already in the post-industrialization society, and they followed that with the consumerist society. And it happened a long time ago. That happened with Edward Bernays in the years following the creation of the Federal Reserve. They were already planning it. It's happening again. And they're creating the imbecile society. And this is what's so frightening to me. I remember before becoming aware of this when I first saw Teletubbies years ago. And all this kind of thing. Right? What is that? What is that? Why are kids told about climbing trees, being bitten by dogs, eating worms, like we all did? That's how you develop your immune system, that's how you develop your social skills. The whole thing in school, okay, I'm not saying bullying in school is wrong, is right, but but being bullied in school can also help you to understand that this is a life lesson, that out there in the real world, there's people who are not very nice. So that this infantilization is happening. They're making us childlike. They want to make people like kids. Grown men obsessed with sports teams like they're 14-year-old boys. You go to America, you have middle-aged men collecting baseball cards. Now, I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with hobbies. But I'm just saying, that's what they're trying to encourage. They're trying to encourage baby men who never grow up, men who never become what they're supposed to be. And likewise, women who want to be young forever. I mean, that's all nice. We all want that, don't we? You know, we all like the idea of having as much fun here as possible. But they're giving them that inside a plastic life. It's a life that has no authenticity. And then at the same time, on top of that, they're telling them there's no such thing as God. There's no such thing as spirituality. Don't go there. Richard Dawkins, it's irrational. It lacks reason. And it's done in a very nasty way. Years ago, I remember atheists years ago would never go around pointing fingers at people saying, you're stupid because you have a spiritual identity. It's quite vicious now what goes on. You know, standing outside churches and slagging people off and going down to, Christian groups and slagging them off. That began with the Nazis. The Nazis, the very first attack the Nazis ever did in a religious group was again in 1919, before they were called the Nazis, but it was the same people running the show, were sent out there to attack a Catholic meeting in Bavaria, and they stabbed a whole bunch of men to death. That was a message, and they did that all through. The SS did that forever. The SS used to pull crucifixes down from churches, turn them upside down and bend them, and tell the people, the kids and the Catholics in the area, Jesus was the son of a Jewish whore, and you no longer have to worship this. This is what they're like. No, it doesn't matter if you believe this stuff or not, but it's true. It's true that we have to have this dynamic to our personality or we're going nuts. I don't care what anyone says. There's a higher rate of suicide among atheists for that reason. I don't care if you're an atheist, I don't care if you worship that projector up there, it doesn't bother me, okay? Once you don't start pushing it on anyone. That's another side of it, cults. And this is how they're trying to kill this awakening community. You think they're coming, everyone thinks they're going to come after us by tapping our phones. They're going to come after us by doing this. No, they're not going to bother with that. You've been watching too many episodes of Mission Impossible. They're going to do things like to try and distract you away from it. They're going to try and create... They will fund these cults, and it's already happened, to move into this movement. And these cults will start attacking people in this community to put them down. And to cause division and murder. Not murder, and mayhem. Who knows? Mayhem. And they will do other things like lead people off into woo. Now, I think woo is great to a point. Okay, no problem with that. I live and let live is my thing. But there are people now going down to the Amazon to take ayahuasca when they've got huge problems at home under the belief that it's going to solve it. That's not good. I have nothing against people doing that. I got a lot of flack recently for that, by saying that, look, it's not a good idea if you have problems at home, because they're going to come home to them. No matter how many spiritual experiences you have, that problem remains. If you don't take care of it in the real world, or it'll manifest in the spiritual world. If you don't take care of it in the spiritual world, it manifests in the real world. It's as simple as that. They both work in tandem. There's two dynamics to our personality. There's two poles of cognitive functioning. Our upper consciousness and our subconscious, and they're attacking us like crazy in our subconsciousness. That's what NLP and hypnotism and all this stuff is about. So I'm very wary of things like that. I'm very wary of these gurus, these very heavily funded and high-profile gurus who saying, you just got to take ayahuasca. Drink it 7 times and you'll be okay. Maybe you will, I don't know, but it's not going to solve the problems in your real life at home. And also, there's another aspect here, and this is something that happened to me studying the whole thing in National Socialism and the growth of these crazy spiritual black magic kind of racist groups, was that I figured out something amazing that had been right in front of my eyes all along. That all these gods, archetypes and spiritual dimensions that people go to Tibet, India and the Amazon to find, we have the bloody things here, we always had. We're just not allowed to enjoy them. They were removed first by the Vatican, then later on by everything else. But that's our archetypes. Our archetypes exist in our own... Now, I'm not saying God stops at a border. I'm not saying that people in spirituality in Africa is better than someone in China. I'm saying they're all equal. But they are indigenous to the culture that we've been raised in because they help us better. I often think, you want to hear the first Christian experience I ever had? You know what happened? It didn't happen in the Holy Land. It happened here in England. You guys do Christianity very, very well. Well, you did. I went to Glastonbury. I went to visit the Abbey. And I can honestly tell you it was one of the best spiritual experiences I've ever had in my life. And I haven't had many. And I had that experience. And I had it because they had something here. There's something going on here. There's something really beautiful about the whole William Blake, Arthurian, Joseph I don't know what it is. I can't explain it. And then it dawned on me. It was because it was the right archetypes for the right culture. And that's why it felt so good. And that's important. And so I went to the Hill of Tara in Ireland and I felt the same way. And I started to read very deep into Irish Celtic mythology, and then I started to read into Nordic mythology. And I've got quite a complex knowledge of it, even things like Thales and Dacian mythology. I've looked at it all, and we all have archetypes that directly, although they're basically the same, they help us better in dealing with our problems in our own lives, because we can understand our destiny as an Irish person, as a Saxon person, as a Visigoth, as a Nordic person, as a Teutonic person. We can understand them better because our archetypes are specific to us. So what's happening? We're told it's a load of rubbish, but the Amazon fairy juice is the truth. I don't agree with that. I mean, I think that's quite a condescending thing to do. Or they say you have to go to Tibet to find the Dalai Lama. You have to follow the CIA employee. To hear him say something that's so trite it wouldn't even be on a Hallmark card. Let me give you an example of the Dalai Lama's wisdom, right? Love is good. That's it. That's his wisdom. That's part of the infantilization. You compare that to someone like William Blake, for God's sake. You compare that to someone like William Blake, William Butler Yeats. You compare that to so much of the European tradition. You compare that even to the Vedas of India. We've been reduced down to McDonald's spirituality, delivered from abroad in a package. Why do you think all these film stars are around them? The same reason the film stars and the Hollywood studios loved the Nazis in the 30s. Folks, if you haven't heard about this one, this is the best one of all. Hollywood loved Hitler until the war started. Because through Leni Riefenstahl and all the propaganda out there, they were able to figure out that these guys know how to use movies to get what they want from their people. Let's indulge them. And so NGM used to have private screenings for the Nazis in the consulate in LA to show them films that we think would be really good in Germany. They were enamored by German cinema. Not because the films were so good, although if you watch films like Leni Riefenstahl's The Triumph of the Will and Olympiad, they are phenomenal films. She was a genius, that woman. She just made a deal with the devil. But they became so intoxicated by the Nazis. As soon as the war starts, you have John Wayne running around as a GI, and it's all forgotten about. It's the same thing that happens with, Bin Laden is our enemy one year, he was a friend last year, Gaddafi, and so on. They did the same thing with culture. So they're very devious, they're very hypocritical, but as I said with that story about the psychopaths in prison not being a rapist anymore, they're not capable of seeing the irony of their own behaviour. And we, and I'm not exaggerating, but what you call this wake-up group, we are the first group in history, and that's no exaggeration. And I'm not saying we're special, we're lucky, because they gave us the poison chalice, they gave us the internet, and they gave us communications. And that's why it's important for all of us to start making blogs. All of us to become conscious insurgents and start getting out there and irritate them. Well, I don't care what your whole thing is. Disrupt the system. In the past, they used to bomb train lines. I'm not saying we can do that violently. I'm totally against anything that's against breaking the law, because it's smarter to stay inside the law and piss them off than it is to piss them off and get yourself arrested. That's just my opinion. I'd rather be smiling and saying, see ya. Then that's it, but don't break the law. But you can do it in lots of ways where you can be an irritant. If enough of us do it, it will come down. But it won't come down the way you've been told, that there'll be an uprising of the people. If anyone still believes that at this point, you're not paying attention. I'm just sorry, it's not happening. It won't happen for many. But what we can do is we can create an evolutionary tangent away, okay? And it will happen, and it is happening. And I've seen it in my own work. When I started talking about this psychopath thing, nobody was doing it. Nobody. Suddenly, John Ronson appears with a book about it. You have Joseph Fallon and his roadshow travelling psychopath slideshow, where a circus show where he shows that he tells the audience, I'm actually a psychopath, but I'm a great guy. And I don't believe he's either. And you have people like Professor Kevin Dutton hosting Psychopath Night on Channel 4, where they tell you psychopaths are great. You have several stories in the Daily Mail recently that were literally lifted from me in terms of James. I put down that James Bond I was probably the first person to openly point out a good psychopathic archetype was James Bond. Suddenly they're admitting that. The same people who slagged me off 3 years ago are now saying, oh, that's true, he is. But he has admirable qualities. He gets things done. So they're changing the goalposts again. From first they would say, they would say to people like me, oh, you're full of crap. Psychopaths are just serial killers. I proved, I and others, and even many of their own people like Robert Hare proved it wasn't. And then they say, well, maybe that's true. But they're really good for the world and the world that we're moving forward in. And so I'm now getting idiots writing to me saying, well, your book is just wrong because you have this attitude that psychopaths are bad. And and according to Professor Kevin Dutton, and I've evolutionary biologists who know anything about it, he's been sent out there, all connected to the Cambridge thing, all connected to the London School of Economics, all connected to creating a new future for you to move into. They're creating a science fiction future where psychopaths are great. And this is what's happening. But I take that as a compliment. You know why? Because I got them. I knocked them off, and others like me knocked them off balance. And they had to do something about it. Imagine if there was thousands of us doing that, constantly knocking them off balance. We'd derail their train eventually, or they'd run out of fuel, trying to keep up. The idea, I always said that the Battle of Armageddon takes place in human consciousness, and it's happening right now, and it really is. Now, we're never going to rise up, get guns, and take them down that way. We're never going to get a just and fair society going forward by protesting down a government building. I'm sorry, that's just how I feel about it. But we will get it by rattling the bisto out of them on every little way we can. Always, if we can jump ahead of them in a creative sense, we'll always be diverting them from the program. And they don't like that. They don't like the idea of them having a plan and us predicting it. to the point now that our magic, this is the whole thing, has to supersede and overtake their magic. So what happens is, instead of them putting the agenda out there and us having to adapt it, we put the agenda out there of what they're planning next, and then we throw our whole plans into chaos. That's how we do it. That's why we have to be very astute and think clearly about what's happening. And the great thing about this is you can do it in your own life, in your own town. You don't have to be standing on a stage, like me doing this. You don't have to do that. This is an individual journey. James Joyce, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell spoke about the monomyth. And this is a beautiful thing. The monomyth was the idea that everything that happened in your life was a mythology, a personal mythology. So if you went through a divorce, it wasn't a catastrophe. You had survived a trial. You were living in your own version of a Grail mystery. You were living in your own Arthurian epic. You were like Dante's Inferno, like Goethe through the 9 gates of hell. So if you had an illness, this is a dragon to be defeated. When you see your life in those terms, and it's not narcissistic, in fact it's the opposite of that, you're finally seeing yourself not as a person, as a being, but as a soul. You understand that you have a personal destiny in this. So when you enter into the monomyth, it becomes a very healing thing, because they want you to believe that through this shock doctrine, that everything that happens to you can only be fixed from an exterior influence. You cannot fix it from inside yourself. That's true sometimes. You might need doctors to cut something out of you if you have a very bad injury. That's great. But other things, like if you run into problems, if you take charge of this in your own life, instead of going, oh my God, where's the Ritalin, where's the Prozac, that kind of thing. Where is it? Instead of doing that and watching, if you watch American television, it's non-stop ads for these antidepressants, these SSRIs. Instead of going that way, you'll say, okay, I've been given a challenge here. I've been given a challenge here, and this is part of my monomyth. And if I survive this, and there's every chance I will, there's very few things you don't survive in life. If you're going down on a plane that's crashing, that's one thing. But if you're having a terrible financial problems, you will survive. You can get out of this. You can hold on to the fact that this is part of your personal destiny. That can be incredibly healing, because then you take ownership of the problem away from you. You take ownership of the problem, and then as a community, we're all doing this. It's the same idea. Suddenly, isn't it a nicer idea to think that we're like, the hobbits on a quest? Without being twee about it, that's what it's like. That's what all the allegories tell us. All the mythologies tell us. The story always comes down in the end. Live your life as your own mythology. Now, before I came to do this presentation, as I always do, I sketch ideas on a pad. I doodle. Sometimes, this time it came into a painting. And this painting represents how I feel right now, okay? You have a wall that has a hole in it. And that hole in that wall is what we've all done in this community. We've broken a hole in the psychopathic control grid. On one side, we have the beast telling us not to go back, warning us, snarling and growling at us, trying to make us fearful. On the other side, we have all the distractions, all the stuff they want to move us away from. They do not want us passing through that wall. The storm is clearing, and I picked that symbol up there about spirals because I found that in every European tradition. I found that in every Nordic, Scandinavian, Gaelic, Pictish, Anglo-Saxon, you name it, was in all. And that represents the restoration of the European soul, because that's what will kill the EU. It's like the Domestos, it kills all known germs dead. That will kill all known bureaucrats dead. That's why they want us obsessed with things that do not belong to us. That's why they tell us that being European is shameful. That's why they're always trying to make us feel bad. I'm not saying we're better. We're equal to people in Africa. We're all brothers and sisters all over the world. We uniquely in Europe, because they created the Nazis and made us ashamed of any kind of nationalism. Now, nationalism is only really bad if it gets nuts and you start thinking you're better than someone else, but otherwise it's nice to have a culture and things like that. And that's the light coming through after the storm is broken. And in the distance behind the wall is a lake filled with water. And to use an alchemical expression, that's the aqua nostra, the fresh rain that's fallen. So we've broken the wall down, and I'm going to step over that. And I hope one day we'll all step over that, and there's no reason why we shouldn't. And all we have to do is just keep moving towards the new world of possibilities, and have no fear of the guardians on either side. So thanks very much for that.